Hello everyone, good afternoon. I have to say, on a rainy Saturday afternoon, this makes me very happy. Thank you all for being here and welcome. My name is Hendrik Folkerts. I'm the curator of international art and head of exhibitions at Moderna Museet. And it really gives me such great pleasure to see so many of you here in our auditorium to welcome Jack Halberstam for the talk Trans asterisk after a trans. Jack, welcome to Stockholm. I know so many of us have been waiting and looking forward to your arrival for months, actually. Thank you for traveling here. Thank you for being here, and I hope the past days have been wonderful and inspiring to you. Because what happened in the past few days? At Uppsala University, some of you have been thinking wildly with Jack Halberstam, so to speak, at a symposium committed to Jack's foundational scholarship in the field of queer, trans, and cultural research. Because indeed, Jack Halberstam, who is currently the Feinstein Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University in New York, has had a significant impact on the thinking about gender and queerness in Sweden. As Jack has been here multiple times over the last, let's say, 20 years, and is also now, in part, at Lund University on the Hesselgren, sorry, my Swedish, professorship in gender studies. And when I say some of you have been thinking wildly with Jack Halberstam, I am of course referring to the profound impact that Jack's work has had on so many of us when it comes to thinking about female masculinity, undoing the binaries, sort of queer temporalities, the art of failure, as well as many sort of trans, feminist, and other revolutionary movements and moments. But I'm also speaking about Halberstam's latest book, Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire, which came out in 2020. In Wild Things, Halberstam offers a critique of the orderly, taxonomic sort of modernist sort of approach that has shaped much of our thinking by proposing an alternative history of sexuality through the lens of the wild and wildness as associated with queerness throughout the, let's say, 20th century. And there is another book in the making, namely a second volume on wildness called Unworlding, an architecture and an aesthetics of collapse. However, until that time, there is plenty more to read. For instance, Halberstam's quintessential work of queer theory, titled Female Masculinity from 1998, or the book In a Queer Time and Place from 2005, which not only opened up new possibilities for, let's say, queer histories and historiographies, but it was the first full-length book of transgender representation in art, film, books, music, and writing. And then Jack Halberstam helped us let go of any sense of normalcy we might have experienced, and thank God, I would say, with the brilliant book Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and the End of Normal, which came out in 2012. This is just sort of an anthological reading. There's, of course, much more. But this is what I mean when I use words like foundational, What I mean with that is that I think the practice of so many of us has been shaped by Jack Halberstam's work. It has been formative, and I, for one, am really thankful for how your work has influenced and impacts to this very day generations of artists, writers, scholars, and weirdos. So thank you, Jack, for being here and for having been with us actually for so long. Now, on that sentimental note, I will gladly make space for the speaker you have all come to see and hear now. But before I do, please allow me to take this moment to thank a few people. First of all, our wonderful partners in a crime, which are seated here on the first row. Uppsala University, I'm going to start there. Professor Ulrika Dahl, who will join Jack Halberstam after the talk for sort of dialogue, let's say. trialogue, I should say, because Samuel will also be there. But Ulrika, thank you so much for this extraordinary sort of opportunity, and I'm looking forward to scheming about the future very soon, because there is more to come, surely. I also wanted to give a very special thanks to Samuel Girma and Sam Hulten, because two dear friends and extraordinary thinkers, makers, and sort of organizers here in the city. This all started with an email from you, in fact, and I feel truly humbled and excited that you feel that this space is the right space to hold this, so thank you so much, truly. Samuel will also join Ulrika and Jack on the stage after the talk in the dialogue, a trialogue. Lastly, I would like to thank everyone who has made this happen. Alan, who's sitting over here. Camilla, I saw you just there. Yes, there you are. David in the booth. All the other people who have worked so hard to host sort of a Jack here. And I'm really wonderful to be working with all of you on this. So as a last note, please put your phones off, because that would be sad if that went off. And there's so much to look forward to this afternoon. So let's get started. Please help me welcome to the stage, a warm Stockholm welcome to Jack Halberstam.
Wow, well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming out today. Thank you to Hendrik for that beautiful setting of the stage. I would like to add my thanks also to Samuel and Ulrika. Ulrika for bringing me this week and organizing and curating a fantastic set of events in Uppsala, and Samuel for helping to organize today's conversation. So, in order for us to have something to talk about, we'll always have something to talk about, but I'm just going to make 5 propositions about what I'm calling trans after trans. And I think it should have been trans after trans asterisk rather than the other way around. Even I got confused there. But what I'm going to do is sort of think back on the little book that I wrote within the last 5 years about trans, just to give us a sense of how rapidly things change in relationship to trans politics. You know, even 4 years ago, I think that I was talking about trans as a new form of identity that was easily folded into neoliberal logics of inclusion and recognition. And now here we are again with a new round of transphobic legislations in the US, new efforts to deny, you know, puberty-blocking hormones to young people, new bathroom bills being sponsored by right-wing politicians in the US, new formations of mums and essentialist female organized groups. I'm not going to call them feminists, you'll see why in a moment, who are challenging trans women's rights to use the bathroom, and so on. So the politics of trans evolve rapidly. They're obviously a kind of touch point for all kinds of national conversations. They're a place where many, many different concerns and anxieties come to bear. So what I want to do today is go back into the category of trans asterisks, remind everyone that I particularly use that asterisk to indicate that there is something about trans that refuses to simply be folded into the binary systems that already exist. Okay, so I'm of the school that doesn't believe that trans people just disappear into the culture, confirm the binary, become part of it, and so on. The asterisk suggests that there's something in transgender embodiment that resists and exceeds the framing, the epistemological and ontological framing that's been offered by the culture for gender expression. And in that asterisk are all kinds of possibilities for coalition, for solidarity, and for politics otherwise. And so that's what we're going to dig into and explore and see how the trans body to the extent that it maintains a degree of flexibility, and to the extent that it exceeds the binary, can be a place for us to rethink both representation and politics. Okay, so it's a tall order, but we'll get there. Don't worry. So in the asterisks, I'm also going to suggest that there are alternative forms of temporality nestling, and we'll look at what those might be. Abstract modes of representation. What is an asterisk? After all, it's a diacritical mark that suggests that there's something in the grammar of the language that cannot express what needs to be expressed, right? So you use a diacritical mark precisely because the language doesn't hold the meaning that you want to convey, like an exclamation point, right? Or a question mark. And therefore, it's a guide towards a certain tonality, but it also suggests that there is something to be expressed that exceeds a representational frame. Therefore, abstraction, okay? But there's also a problem with the figure in terms of trans representation, because when we always represent transness through the figure, potentially without realizing, we're now committed to a particular model of the human, a particular model of temporality, a particular model of politics and representation. So I'm going to push towards a kind of abstract representation, as I have for the last 20 years, but at the same time, find space for the figurative representations that we have available to us. I also want to propose trans histories that are non-heroic and non-memorializing, that are not, again, built only through extraordinary figures, but that recognize what many people are calling trans ecologies, ecologies of being, within which trans people, in coalition and in solidarity with others, shift and change the atmospherics of any given political moment. Okay, so that's just a roadmap of where I think that we're going to go. Let's see how we will get there. So, on behalf of prompting conversation, both with Samuel and Ulrika, but also with you, the audience, I'm going to make some statements that are a bit controversial and some that are not so controversial. This one seems not very controversial until, and I'll dig into it in a moment, we see the kinds of claims that some people want to make at the moment about non-binary bodies. So I just want to remind us that essentially speaking, a trans body is neither a source of resistance nor an obvious site for conformity. You can't make a claim on the basis of trans, either that trans people are just part of the binary or that they essentially oppose it. There isn't a predetermined politics that comes with trans. You can have an incredibly conservative trans person, Caitlyn Jenner, right? Do you remember Caitlyn Jenner? She was the former Bruce Jenner, who came out as part of the Kardashian media empire, not because she was some brave trans activist, but this was a nice turn in the story of the Kardashian empire and generated millions more dollars for their products that they are selling. So we should not place the burden of political radicality on trans people, nor should we assume that all trans people share any particular kind of oppositional position. What is true is that the markers of race and class continue to indicate the vulnerability, precarity, and relationship to oppression that any given body might have. And therefore, trans people are not necessarily at the lowest point of a social hierarchy. It absolutely depends upon race and class as to the level of their precarity. And so it makes no sense, for example, to say trans women are the most vulnerable people in the society. Which trans women? If we're talking about trans women of color who are also sex workers, yes, that makes sense. If we're talking about white trans women who formerly potentially worked as men in the tech industry, not necessarily. So these kinds of claims are not helpful or useful politically. So we have to hold on to the possibility that trans can push in many different political directions at once. Now, this is an important thing to say at the moment because right now, historically, a new category has emerged just in the last 5 years, in English at any rate, and it's probably being used mostly in English in other language cultures, and that is non-binary. So you can see the same debates being fought about non-binary that were previously fought over the category of transgender. Non-binary, I would say, is a category that has been authored by young people to say no, not just to the binary gender system, but to the binary of trans versus gender normative that is forced upon them when they articulate discomfort with any given gender position, right? And so when a young person says, I'm non-binary, they may later come out as trans, or they may later come out as gender normative. But in that moment, they're trying to hold at bay this now sort of medical system that swoops in to tell them the meaning of their gender discomfort. So non-binary is actually a very important holding category. However, there's a theorist recently who's made big claims about the category of non-binary, and this is a long quote, so I'll just read it for you. And this is an essay that we talked a lot about in Uppsala this week. Kaji Amin is a trans man, and he's suggesting that non-binary is an empty category and one that has no particular association with exclusion, marginalization, or oppression, but is in fact a place where colonial fictions of the self get consolidated. That's the gloss on the paragraph. And he says, non-binary identity is therefore not, as some non-binary people would have it, a radical refusal of the colonial gender binary. For binary Western thinking has governed every step in the history of Western gender sexual categories, generating an idealized opposite for each new category coined. So his point is you can't step out of this by simply saying non-binary. The core binary that governs non-binary thought, however, is less that between binary and non-binary than that foundational to Western thought between the ontological sovereign subject, I'll say what that means in a moment, and the unchosen genealogical bonds of the social. It is therefore difficult to imagine an identity more provincially Western and less decolonial than contemporary non-binary identity. These are fighting words. This is a polemical essay. And what he's pushing back on is the idea that anyone can simply announce their identity, ontological, sovereign individual. We don't make up our identities. We enter into what he calls unchosen genealogical bonds of the social. An order pre-exists us. We step into it. We're given vocabularies. We're told to articulate who we are in terms of those pre-filled out category identities. And therefore, the idea that a generation of people can simply make up a new word and step into it, he says, is a colonial fiction where you just make up the world and then other people sort of have to follow along. So this claim has generated enormous opposition among students, the students that I teach it to, for the way in which it's accusing non-binary identified people of being embedded in a fantasy of self-determination. Now, the reason I think that this is a problem is because everybody entertains a fantasy of being self-determined, not just non-binary people. When the category transgender came to be, that was generated through vernacular systems within the trans community who wanted to push back on medical terminologies for who they were, like transsexual. So I think that, you know, we can be cautious about the category of non-binary, and Kaji Amin is correct that there's no law against being non-binary. There's no long history of oppression and segregation and marginalization of non-binary people. But it's not right to accuse one particular group of the fiction of ontological sovereignty when everyone in the society is subject to that sense that we all have that we are determining our own identity, that that identity was not handed to us. So what would be a better narrative about non-binary? A better narrative would be that young people are pissed off in all kinds of ways with the world as it currently exists, as it has been authored by the people who came before them, whether in relation to the environment, the body, toxicity, pollution, the economy, debt, etc. And therefore, they are, basically looking for other languages to describe who they are. All right. So rather than adjudicating the conservative nature of non-binary, as Kaji Amin does, I think it makes much more sense to figure out why young people in particular were looking for another category and then start talking about that sense of deep dissatisfaction in the status quo. Okay, so we can build on that and work with younger people to think about the change that is necessary rather than accusing them of being the dupes of some kind of identitarian system. Okay, so this one, you see, we'll move hopefully quite briskly through these 5 points. This one's going to be more controversial. I'm ready for the pushback. Let's have the conversation, okay? Let me just make a case, and then you're more than welcome to disagree. So I want to ask us to worry a little bit about current discussions of TERFs, all right? And so I'm making this claim that casting feminism as the most ferocious of all sources of transphobia limits our ability to do certain things politically, like connect reproductive politics, for example, to trans politics. So some of the same people who want to limit young trans people's access to hormones and surgeries also don't want abortion to be available to women, to young women. This is, obviously I'm talking about the US, but the US is where a lot of these political formations take place. So I want to, I don't want to say, it's not that I don't think that Mumsnet and these various female-led groups are expressing destructive transphobia. They absolutely are. They are powerful groups. They have impacted legislation. They are expressing deep concerns about their children being in the bathroom with trans women. And what they really mean is that they're worried about their kids being in the bathroom with predatory straight men. But they say that they're concerned about trans women because trans women is a figure that they can do something about. If we all wanted to have a conversation about predatory straight men, I'm all for it, right? I'm here for that. I would love for us to be having a generalized conversation about why so many people are worried about men with guns, men who rape, men who abuse, incels, all of these violent, expressive forms of heteropatriarchal masculinity. And I know that that is what is behind the TERF campaign against trans women using the bathroom. So I think we should be trying to change that discourse. But the thing that I really want to push back on is that these women have anything to do with feminism whatsoever, okay? Because if we cede feminism to that position by calling them TERFs, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, we've lost a major site of potential coalition and affiliation. Now, I know why we're calling them trans-exclusionary radical feminists, because there's some idea that these women today are connected to radical feminists from the past, like Sheila Jeffries and Janice Raymond. But those women were very often critiqued within their own communities. They did emerge out of radical feminist politics of the 1970s. They were TERFy, some of them. They were trans-exclusionary. But they faced huge amounts of opposition within the radical feminist communities that they existed in. So who are the other women who were opposing them? Are they not radical feminists? Why are those the radical feminists? Why are those not conservative women who are traveling under the banner of feminism, but actually their politics puts them outside of that purview? Now, if everyone just wants to give up on feminism, let's do it. Let's do it. But what will be the language to describe the way in which the same people who are anti-trans are anti-abortion? Where will that language come from? And don't, in fact, women assigned female at birth and trans women have lots in common? And the answer to that is yes. And there are feminists around the world who have figured out how to bring together so-called cis women and trans women. And I want to give you, before we do that, let me tell you about this fabulous novel in which TERFs are represented as the biggest danger in a fantasized speculative future. So I don't know if anyone has read this post-apocalyptic narrative, trans female narrative by Gretchen Felker-Martin. It's called Manhunt. And here's the mise-en-scène of the novel. So Felker-Martin depicts a post-apocalyptic world in which two trans women are on the run from a world in which testosterone turns men into feral beasts. So something has gotten into the water or whatever. And you know how there are all these apocalyptic fears that men are going to lose their fertility, that sperm counts drop because of pollution and so on. She turns it the other way and says something intensifies testosterone and men just become animals. They're just weird feral things running around in the world and you have to shoot them upon sight, which is very satisfying as a concept. But that's not the real horror of the world. The world is still being run, and it's being run in an authoritarian fascist way by trans-exclusionary radical feminists. So this is a massive leap to say, in the future, the thing that we should be most worried about are these trans-exclusionary radical feminists. I mean, look around the world. In what site of conservative populism do we see TERFs actually running anything? Do you know what I mean? Like if we would say, what is the problem today? Bolsonaro led an autocratic, authoritarian, racist, anti-poor people regime in Brazil. Trump, Boris Johnson, your right-wing government. These are populated by mostly white men who want to hold on to the system as such that benefits them and manages to disempower, dispossess, and derelict many other populations. So I guess what I want to say is, like, in what imaginary could this happen where feminists are going to run the world and they're going to run it by chasing down trans women? That's the premise of the book. So the trans women need their own hormones in order to remain feminized, and so they hunt down men and then distill estrogen from men's testicles. That's why you get this manhunt image on the front of the book. And the book it's fabulous, it's super violent, I loved it. But I'm not sure about this now elevation of TERFs to the future rulers of a world in which trans people are going to be targeted by this authoritarian regime. So there was a recent issue of Transgender Studies Quarterly dedicated to the topic of TERFs, and in the intro essay, Greta Lafleur and her collaborator Bassi wrote a recent article on gender-critical movements and TERFs, and they call gender-critical movements and TERFs, they put together the right-wing anti-gender movements that have swept through Europe and Latin America, put those together with TERFs to create what they call post-fascist feminism. Now, I would probably call that post-fascist gender politics rather than post-fascist feminism. And I'm going to tell you why. I want to turn to another feminist who is successfully articulating a feminism built on the basis of trans feminism. And so let's just say TERFs are not feminists, and we probably are going to have to come up with another word then for what TERFs are. So these Mumsnet groups in the UK are not feminists, they're not radical. They're not radical at all, they're conservatives, they want to keep things the way they are. It doesn't make sense to call them radical. They are easily, comfortably at home with Christians and with other anti-trans groups that have a right-wing orientation. They are not left-wing. There's nothing feminist about them. They are better allied with Christian conservatives than with feminism. Okay. If you go to Argentina, you will find examples of successful feminist groups that understand themselves as trans feminist, that have successfully pushed back on anti-abortion bills and anti-trans measures in Argentina through coalition, mass movements, and solidarity. And that is only possible because there isn't a deep culture of turf, anti-turf rhetoric there. Instead, the rhetoric is around a kind of Marxist, feminist understanding of the general strike. And so this is the group, Ni Una Menos, and the person who's written a really amazing book about this is Veronica Gago, who's an Argentinian feminist. It's called Feminist International. And building upon the Marxist feminist work of Rosa Luxemburg, she argues that we need a general strike. Now, for Marxists in the 30s and 40s, the general strike was understood as a working class stoppage of labor that would bring capitalism to its knees. What Gago and others are saying is we can't organize around the notion of a working class anymore. That remains very much a kind of white politics. It centers upon men and people who are in the formal economy. What we need is a general strike that brings together all the workers who fall outside of the formal economy, sex workers, people who are being trafficked, people who work for money under the table, like house cleaners and gardeners, poor women who are not able to work because they're doing childcare, domestic laborers who are not paid formally, women who work in the home and are considered not to be doing labor that requires money and reimbursement and so on. Trans women, all kinds of people gather under this banner. And what Gago says is, if you get the broadest possible coalition, and now you call a general strike, you'll stop the world. And that's actually the goal. That's their banner, is stop the world. Okay, and I know there's a song in there somewhere, but let's just, repress that. She says, she defines this energy as feminist potencia, and some people will hear an echo of some of Paul Preciado's work in there, who also calls upon us to find these other streams of energy that course through different bodies and create non-identitarian coalitions, which are the only way to oppose the system as it currently exists on behalf of authoritarian capitalism. So Gago writes that her book seeks to be a manifesto of that indeterminate potencia, expressed as what? As the desire to change everything. And that's really important. Not the desire to change sex, not the desire to change a bathroom bill, not the desire to change the government, the desire to change everything. So if you want to change everything, you need everyone. You don't need a few people. You don't need divisions within the left. You need coalition. And her book shows how they did that in Argentina. And it's a combination of kind of theory, massification. She talks about massification, getting as many people as possible into the streets, which means you need solidarity, and working outside of the usual vocabularies of revolutionary change. That's the Gago way. And she says, for example, the mass resonance of the call to the streets, given what we knew was simultaneously happening in other countries, made this day where they opposed the abortion bill an unforgettable day of collective effervescence, where we shared scenes of everyday contempt, gossip about revolt, anonymous whispers on a day that, as we sang in the rain, we stopped the world and we found ourselves. So this idea of finding each other is a very important, radical concept. And finding each other means not being locked into identitarian differences where we are disaggregated in our political will from each other and we are set against each other. This is not to say that under other circumstances we will make political cause with TERFs. We will not. But we will rescue that category of feminism from whatever uses it is being put to there, precisely because this massification depends upon the coalition between women assigned female at birth, and trans women. And there's even a fabulous novel in Argentina called Bad Girls that describes exactly this coalition, written by a trans author, that is about a loosely formed coalition of prostitutes, trans sex workers who gang together to change the world. They find a baby in the street, so they're raising a baby, and there many, many different things happen. But there's all kinds of stuff that is available in Gago. And just to conclude this section then, Gago uses the term transversal. That's a fabulous term, transversal. It appears in several different theoretical vocabularies. You can probably find it in Deleuze and Guattari, but she uses it to suggest the kinds of alliances that need to happen. And I say here, her book is a reminder that these quarrels between trans women and TERFs are part of a gender discourse that, in her words, organizes the world so that we do not find each other. That's really important, that there are certain structures in place that prevent people from talking to each other. And if we allow those structures to stand, then we can't move forward. The transversal doesn't work through sameness. It does not disregard differences. But through the strike, it allows for new lexicons of political alliance and political identity. And then finally, like Moten and Hani in the Undercommons, Gago proposes that by no longer placing our faith in solutions from the state, we alter the plane of solutions or responses, right? So there's that desire to change everything. We don't want the state to do it. We will do it. But we have to find each other first. So that's kind of that's my pitch, disagree or agree, but we have to produce, other forms of political coalition. In order to do that, we need to re-script the histories that we give each other, and we give particularly to young people about who we are, who we were, and how we came to be. So number 3 out of 5 then is we've shaped narratives of queer and trans community, history, and struggle in ways that drain rebellion and struggle out of the past and replace it with simple memorialization, usually of individuals. Trans history has to make time itself strange, okay? So what do I mean by that? Most histories are like, everyone was just moving along in this, homophobic way, transphobic way, and then in 1969 there was a rebellion at Stonewall, and suddenly everything changed. That's nonsense, actually. That's not even a real representation of what happened at Stonewall, and it doesn't serve us well to keep telling this nonsense narrative to each other. What it does is produce individuals who led a rebellion. One little rebellion. There were hundreds of these staged rebellions by queer and trans people who will never be known and never be named. And none of them were necessarily in that club that night across the country, not just in New York City. Clubs were constantly being raided by police, and people were constantly pushing back. And there was no solidarity in that Stonewall rebellion either, because the very people who led that rebellion, the drag queens, were also being shouted down at the gay and lesbian parades, and so you have this great YouTube video of Sylvia Rivera getting up on the stage and saying, listen, you don't want to hear from me. I'm a trans woman of color, but I'm going to speak because there are trans and queer people in jail, and you guys don't care about them. And I do, and I have an organization, and if you want to join me, come along. And she was shouted down and kicked off the stage and so on. So this narrative of some moment of unity is a nonsense narrative. Eric Stanley, in a great book called Atmospheres of Violence, precisely about this question of how we shape these nonsense histories, says, in fact, that neoliberal forms of governance, he reminds us, work through inclusion, not exclusion. And they claim the right to violence as part of their security regimes. So he's proposing that we should, 1, be very suspicious of inclusivity, and 2, we should not be trying to reform institutions so that we can enter into them. We should be trying to tear everything down. He doesn't say it like that, I do, but he says something like, justice would require the dismantling of its own administration. In other words, you can't get justice from an unjust system designed to protect white men from everybody else. You just can't. In the context of the US, the American Constitution was signed by white men for white men on behalf of people with property who owned other people as property. That can't be the route to liberation for anybody else. The state that emerges from that covenant is not a state that administers justice. Justice will require the dismantling of its own administration. So we should be thinking in terms of anti-institutional politics, the dismantling of forms of so-called justice, the law, medicine, museums, universities. These kinds of institutions have to come apart in order for change to happen. But let's go back to Stonewall for a minute, because Stanley is also very critical of this tendency to build a neat little narrative about queer rebellion out of Stonewall. And he reminds us that, you know, it was not Stonewall where rebellion was happening, but Starr. And with, you know, the figures of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera have been taken up as the figures of the people who led the Stonewall Rebellion, when in fact they were in their own group called the Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries. Stonewall would not have made sense to them. They had a revolutionary group, Starr, and it was using the category of transvestite, not the category of gay, lesbian, and certainly not transsexual even at this point. So we have to recognize the actual goals and identities of the people who were staging rebellion, rather than folding everyone into this lovely narrative that then emerges as a kind of pride parade, right, where we invite all these corporate entities to come and celebrate with us. And again, you know, that happens because of this Stonewall narrative. Because if you believe in this emergence narrative, you know, as something great, we rose up, we revolted, and now we're part of society too. Come on, corporate businesses, come on, banks, you know, come on, police, come march with us. That's what you get from that history. But if you want a different kind of future, you need a different kind of history, and you're going to have to go back and make it. So Stanley says that Sylvia and Marsha, along with so many others, ought to be brought into the collective archive. And here's the kicker. But if their appearance does not destabilize the mode of their arrival, then we have failed to do much more than accommodate difference, the neoliberalization of identity as modernity's sedimentation. So if you want to turn Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, two trans women of color, into the heroes of your movement, you can't do so without changing what you understand the movement to be. They can't just be the figureheads for white LGBT rebellion. And so that's what he means by destabilizing the mode of their arrival. And I think that that is a great way to think about history as something that's constantly being undone and unwritten by the various events and figures and rebellions that you uncover. We should not have stopped at Stonewall. We should be looking for many other sites of oppositional force from that period and writing different histories based on those. And so here's a beautiful figure for that in the first painting that I'm going to show tonight, which is by a trans artist based in New York, Lydie Churchman, who's taken a photograph by Emily Royston, also now known as Every Ocean Hughes, who used to be based in Stockholm, and turned it into a painting. So Lydie repaints the photograph by Every. And here, it's in this kind of work that you can find the image of the past that I think Eric Stanley is directing us towards. The main thing in this painting is emptiness. The piers were there. This is a painting of the place where the piers were, the piers which were on the west side of New York City, along the West Side Highway, populated by queers and homeless people and drug addicts and all kinds of people who were not at Stonewall that night but had their own rebellions. It's where Sylvia Rivera lived, in the piers, homeless, in shacks that people put up and down the Hudson there. So what Leidy is painting here is a kind of emptiness, the space that is not memorialized, the space that we do not remember as the beginning, starting point for a particular historical narrative. So I think that this is a much better way of looking back. Thinking about New York before gentrification, thinking about these stumps as sort of a graveyard of a sort, right? These look a little bit like graves poking up out of the water, or maybe there's a submerged world down there that is the past that we should be looking for. The piers are now just these sites of ruination. They look like odd, dark limbs reaching out from the water. The shipwreck of the past, if you like, is figured in this image as a reminder that we have to leave the past in ruination, not rebuild it, tidy it up, and then pull a figure or two out to represent its memorialization. Okay, moving towards a conclusion here. I'm conscious of the time, and I'll try to finish in the next 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, so let's think then in terms of these different models of temporality. If it's not going back, looking for rebellion, looking for a few people, putting them up on the screen, saying, yay, we're free now, which we know we're not, we need a concept of transtemporality, a different understanding of time that would disrupt the forward momentum of both conventional history and the transition narrative itself, okay? So one thing that the transition narrative does is it mirrors that historical narrative of once this thing was bad, and then there was a moment of transition and change, and then wholeness emerges from it. As most trans asterisk people know, that is not at all a good story of transition. Transition is not a temporal linearity, and it loops around and spirals and goes up and down, back and forth, and so on. What does that look like? I actually have an example. And this is a book that I actually really love, and I know it's been translated into Swedish recently, so you can read it in Swedish. Detransition Baby, which even in the title points to a different understanding of temporality and transition, right? And here the detransition is not the transphobic version where somebody, you know, is pushed into transition too early and then comes to regret it. It's a completely different understanding of detransition, which we'll get to. But in the book, as opposed to these potted Stonewall narratives, community is a beautiful and necessary failure. Necessary because other connections need to be made outside of the trans community. Community is kind of a site of coercion rather than a site of possibility. Detransition as a way of backing out of the failed promise that when you transition, now you'll be a woman in the society and that will be the end of it. In fact, the character who detransitions in the book does so because the culture is uninhabitable for trans women. Because the culture is so phobic, this character finds that they cannot exist as a trans woman within it. The disappointment and the failed promise is within the culture, not within transition itself. And so instead of having this like nice narrative where somebody realizes something and then transitions, the narrative is really about unmade selves, selves that come apart, come together, units that form, couples that form, people break up. There's a constant kind of temporal fluctuation throughout the novel. For example, do you know the plot of this novel? Yes, a little bit. Okay. So there's a trans woman, Reese, who always wanted to be a mother, but as a trans woman can't give birth herself. Her former partner, oh gosh, now I can't remember the former partner's name. Ames, thank you, who Reese and Ames were together, both of them as trans women. Ames detransitions, has a relationship with a straight woman. She gets pregnant, and now there's a baby to be, okay? And the woman with whom he's now detransitioned, has a relationship with is an Asian American woman who has many, dissatisfactions with heterosexuality herself. So it's a really kind of compelling story that takes apart these seemingly natural categories of woman, man, family, transition, and so on, and instead pulls everything apart. Now, you should remember that there's a baby to be born, and yet that baby, within the exegetic time of the novel, never is born. And at the end of the novel, we don't know if it will be born. And in that context, then, this normative temporality that is mapped by the 9 months of pregnancy never comes to be. And we don't know if it ever will come to be. That's the time of the novel. The time of the novel is the might be, but might not be. That kind of weird, hypothetical future that could be the future of an abortion or could be the future of a birth. We don't know which. Some characters transition, some detransition. Some characters get together, some come apart. There are various characters who suicide. There's a kind of deathly understanding of time as well. And then finally, there's a connection made, that connection that TERF discourse disallows, between the straight woman and the trans woman. And so Reese says at one point, in relationship to the cis woman who's carrying the baby, she says, we're like each other because divorce is a transition story. Of course, not all divorced women go through it, says Reese. I'm talking about the ones who felt their divorce as a fall or a total reframing of their lives, the ones who have seen how the narratives given to them since girlhood have failed them, feminism, but who know there is nothing to replace it all, but who still have to move forward without investing in new illusions or turning bitter, or with no plan to guide them. That's as close to a trans woman as you can get. Divorced women are the only people who know anything like what I know. So there's that unity, that possibility of coalition through a trans-temporality that unites the divorced woman who went into heteronormative time and had to back out of it. And in that backing out meets the trans woman as she's coming back out of the marriage, and then they move forward in trans time, okay? Now we have different understandings of futurity and historicity. All right, so this is my conclusion then. Given everything that I've argued for a feminism that is not cannibalized by TERFs, for a temporality that is separate from a kind of normative, linear, progressive temporality, for a representation of history that allows for these broad coalitions rather than picking figures, many of whom are, the normative white figures of gay and lesbian life out of the past and building these mythic narratives around them. Given that I've argued that trans is not essentially one thing or another, I think it matters greatly how you represent trans life. And to the point that you're able to build a lot of complexity, opacity, and other things, illegibility into trans representation, you provide a kind of framework within which we can say more complex things to each other about who we are and what we want. So mostly trans representation has worked with the figure, and I'm arguing that trans representation, trans asterisk representation, works with figure and ground, figuration and abstraction, landscapes and interior or psychic geographies. And I'll just conclude with a few examples. So here are some fabulous figurative representations of trans life, going back to Claude Cahun's images from the 1940s, Kathy Opie's famous portraits of trans ambiguous bodies in the 1990s, and of course, Del Grace Volcano's irreplaceable archive of trans and queer lives from the 80s to the present. So I'm not making an argument simply against the figure. I'm saying that trans representation should not be limited to the figure, and that it is weakened by always being associated with the figure. So here's another image by Del Grace Volcano from a fantastic project that they did. They that they did with Maj Adebayo, titled Maj of the Arctic. And this was really about the strangeness of finding a black queer figure in the white landscape of the Arctic. And it was a really gorgeous series. But in this image, there is no figure. And yet we are still in a trans atmosphere. There's something very otherworldly about this image. I don't know whether it's been inverted, but it's very difficult to tell the difference between sky, ground, and water. And Maj is not completely distant from this image just because they don't appear within it. We could say that Maj is joined thematically and phenomenologically to questions about ambiguity, genre, porousness, definition, and backdrop. The images of Maj that Dell took speak to the overexposure of the black body, the relationships between landscape and race, whiteness and black identity, and so on. But here, the black body is relieved of its obligation to endlessly represent otherness. And the otherness is transferred onto the strange landscape that nobody inhabits. And that's kind of what we're seeing. We're seeing something uninhabitable. This is another trans piece, trans artist, Jan Grönenberg, who has this installation, Objects Are Slow Events. And Grönenberg makes string sculptures. That's what you're looking at here. You're looking at a room full of string sculptures. And David Getze has asked in relationship to this work, what does it mean for an artist to make works that are hard to see? Okay, and for trans people, it means a certain kind of liberation in the sense of not being endlessly visible there, standing out in some way. So the string sculptures are a kind of relief, but they're also a question posed to the politics of visibility. And here's another one like that by another artist interested in trans representation, L.A. Perez, who is using the play of light on a testosterone vial to represent this transversal transness, rather than showing us the actual body or the person shooting testosterone into the body. Perez writes, you can use photography to depict things that you can actually not picture. This has so much to do with identity and how surfaces have the ability to contain the traces of an experience. So already we're saying different kinds of things about the body and representation. Now, this is where I want to end tonight, is with the amazing work by a black non-binary artist based in New York, with whom I worked when they were a student at Columbia, Kian Williams. This is a gorgeous sculpture that was in the Socrates Sculpture Park in Queens, New York for a long time. And there's a sense that it kind of mirrors, do you remember this piece by Every Ocean Hughes, where the past is reaching up out of the ground? And in this one, I'll just go back to it for a second. In this one, Kian is speaking to the past of blackness, transness, a kind of disembodied relationship to the histories that are told about black trans bodies. And then finally, I want to end then with this piece by Kian Williams, which speaks to the theme of dismantling and taking things apart that I've been rehearsing here today. This is called An Accumulation of Things That Refuse to Be Discarded. The bricks are taken from demolished low-income housing, mostly occupied by people of color. And as I say here, it represents both an impulse to save and an impulse to refuse rescue. Okay, where rescue is always a kind of white altruism. They are a non-binary artist representing a figure that is also ground, foundation that is also suspension, object and subject in the same sculpture. So these examples then offer us ways of thinking about non-human landscapes, immersion in other elements, monuments to black survivance, and all point to alternative political projects in which feminism is central. History is not punctuated by one or two memorable events. Trans and non-binary people articulate political theory rather than assume a preordained position, and art leads to less certain and more complex braidings of futurity, pastness, lostness, foundness, figure, ground, materiality, ideology, refusal, and rebellion. The work that I've referenced here looks past idealizations and reductions, offers vistas, landscapes, snow, ice, water, sites of demolition, tales of detransition, life after life, art after representation, trans after trans. Thank you.
Wow. I can't even begin to tell you how nice it is to see a full room of queer, trans, feminist, activist community and kids as well. Hi, kids. Great that you're all here.
Yeah.
I think we need these moments, these gatherings more than ever in these bleak times that we're in. So thank you so much for taking the time to come out today. And of course, thanks so much to Moderna Museet for the beginning of a collaboration between us, and to Uppsala University for funding the event that we've just had. Yep. So we don't have tons of time, so we'll just jump right into it. So just a couple of quick remarks to you, Jack. Thank you so much for this. And I think we would need another Thinking Wildly with Jack Halberstam symposium to unpack all the things that were in that.
Definitely.
So just a couple of things that I was thinking about. First of all, thank you for naming what is often called gender critical or TERF feminism, what it is, which is post-fascist gender politics and not feminism, right? I think that that's a crucial intervention that we need to all continue to think and grapple with. It does make me sort of wonder what we put into the notion of radical, because of course we see all kinds of radical conservative politics as well. So maybe a word or two more about, you know, what for you is radical in radical feminism. Yeah. Like you, I would hold on to a different kind of genealogy there as well. So that's one comment. A second comment is, I really do love the notion of the general strike. And there's been lots of discussions in Swedish media recently about why are we not striking? They're striking in France, they're striking in Britain, they're striking everywhere. You know, these times are horrible, but there isn't such a thing as showing up for a general strike. And that made me think about the kind of coalition that you were describing through Gago here, which is one of, let's say, a different kind of class, namely sex workers, domestic workers, folks that are typically in the home, let's say, or, you know, maybe in the streets, but they're not in particular places where we can organize. And those of us who have histories of doing labor organizing know what it's like to knock on doors and say, hey, come on out, come and vote, be part of the union. So how do we actually go about assembling that riotous group of people when we're so dispersed? I think that that's really an interesting question. And it reminded me of something Virginie Despentes once said, which is that the notion of sisterhood is radical. The idea of going out to the streets is radical for bourgeois women who've all been separate in the house. It just seems completely counterintuitive somehow. So there is something about the ways in which domestic and public space figures into how we can imagine this. And was that? Yeah, we don't need to run out. No.
Not yet.
Yeah. So, and because I'm really interested in that sort of coalitional politics that you're talking about, and I'm talking specifically about feminist politics here, as that's what I'm doing, more than trans politics for a range of obvious reasons. So that was my second sort of question / comment. And the third one goes back to what you said in the beginning about non-binary, which I think was a really important intervention as well. And it's a question that I asked you the other day, which is, we used to have a term called genderqueer. That's now been replaced, I think, in many ways by non-binary. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on why that is. What happened to genderqueer, and what does non-binary do or don't do that a previous term did? So that's my sort of comments. Thank you.
Those are awesome. But did you want to begin?
I can just say, my head is full of thoughts. First of all, so nice to see so many of you that I saw on the dance floor yesterday with the same eyelashes. I don't know, I'm hanging out a lot with my mom these days, which I love. It's a complex relationship, and I think of her as the possible recipient of turf politics. You know, a working class, a migrant woman who has given her best years to this country, country that does not give her back anything. And I am constantly, worried about her future retirement and what that could look like.
Yeah.
But she's also the perfect target to turf politics that would speak, and pretend that they care about her. And then I sort of like, it is trans feminism that is going to change the conditions that she is under. And that made me thinking about like building coalitions, and so I'm gonna come back to that.
But why would she be, do you think, susceptible to turf discourse? Turf discourse is so much about whiteness and just like, oh, I'm just worried about my child, and the world is white, and the only thing I have to worry about is my child going to the bathroom. As opposed to, I think most migrant groups are like, there's a lot of other stuff to worry about.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think also the way whiteness operates, but I would also like, particularly in my mom's case, I'm thinking she's a Christian, and I grew up in a kind of weird Christian kind of household, and that where there is a lot of turf discourse about family values and etc. But also far more than that, the same institution that she really trusts would never address the working conditions, and I do like, and I'm like, okay, coalition with my mom, she has a lot more in common with our people, my people.
Yeah.
So that is where I'm like, also because, I don't know, the older I get, the more, I'm not a positive person, as many people know, in terms of politics. But I'm also learning, like, coalition is what's going to save us. I'm going to give a quick example. I started to dive into the Black Panther Party, and for many obvious reasons. And one of their most, I would say, what made them super dangerous were not the fact that they were separatists. It was because they could organize with other groups, and including working class white people.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so there's like, in particularly the example of the Chicago chapter, in which their leader, Fred Hampton, whom I'm sure many of you know, who was shot by the FBI, 90 bullets at the age of 21, formulated this coalition in order to change society, and said, no, we have to organize with workers. We have to organize with workers across to change. We have to mobilize with the gay liberation movement. There was no, so I am starting to formulate what transfeminism is doing for us, that's going to liberate us from the conditions that we are. And I don't know, coalitions, I can maybe continue with my partner in crime in Radical Love series, Samuel Girma, who could not be here today. They're sick home, so sending him love. But when we did the series Radical Love, Care as Resistance, it sort of was like trying to understand what the politics of care could look like. And what it ended up being was, I'm sure many of you who've been there know, that it became a beautiful space where coalitions were being formulated. And that really is, I know, like, entering this phase of fascism that we are in. Coalition building is what's going to save us. And turf territory and turf discourse, I do believe, in the sort of like, like this making us not talk to each other, that exists within certain separatist movements, like the way Black Panther Party would be like described as like this,
Black nationalist
exactly,
party.
But was actually like a working class party.
Exactly. exactly, which was what made it so threatening to the government, to the point that its leaders were assassinated. Whereas in fact, you know, the feminists at that time who thought that they were being targeted by the FBI, it turns out they were not. This is partly why Janice Raymond and others at the time in the 70s articulated this worry about trans women, because they thought that trans women were FBI agents who had dressed up as women to infiltrate the groups, but they weren't expressing a broad vision of social uprising. They weren't a concern for the FBI for precisely the reasons you just gave. And that's the thing, this other version of feminism that actually is radical, that is associated with the strike, that understands itself through solidarity, is a deeply threatening feminism. But it's held at bay by the internecine squabbles that keep trans women in a place where they think the most scary part of the current political scaffolding and architecture is embodied by this Christian mum. She is a problem, but she's not the problem. You know, she's a small part of a much bigger structure that makes it seem as if she's the problem. And I think that the question then that we're all at, well, how do we do this? The question is a question that is partly answered by what Fred Moten and Stefano Hani call study. These are not simple things to figure out how to create a broad-based coalition. You actually have to read a lot. You know, for example, you have to read the Black Panther archives. You have to read Rosa Luxemburg. You have to know what went right or wrong in a previous struggle. And so the fact that the university is also being targeted now, particularly the humanities, is part and parcel of the way in which our potential uprising is being foreclosed. It's being foreclosed by institutional intervention that looks like it's just a kind of neutral administrative thing, when in fact it is the disarming of a potential coalition that could be disastrous.
There's a lot of things that I was trying to write on my phone when you were speaking, but the possibilities also in the asterisks. You know, one of the guests to Radical Love was Hill Malatino.
Oh yeah, Hill,
incredible trans scholar, and he was talking about art as, you know, seeing the abstracts in the art and the possibilities within that, and that possibility to me liberates us a lot. But also because trans people are expected to be sure about themselves.
That's
Day
right.
one.
Right. Exactly.
Right? So, and then that sureness is expected not to change.
Right.
You know, trans kids should know who they are. Like, it's such an insane thing to think about. Like,
that's not how people live in a body.
Exactly.
You know, you try things out, right? But God forbid a trans person try something out, because then they made a mistake, you know, whereas some straight dude who's trying out a blowjob, you know, with another guy is like, we don't see now, oh, the disaster of the decision he made, you know.
I call it my 20s, but fine.
Okay, yeah, exactly.
Nor do you consider all the young women who are altering their faces and lips and breasts and all the rest of it as ruining their futures, in the same sense that other kinds of.
Yeah, and I really like your thoughts on gender queerness, Ulrika. It is interesting that category didn't seem to hold for another generation, but I think it's partly because young people do think that the problem is a structural one, and the structure is defined as binary, and therefore they want to be non-binary. I'm not trying to be patronizing by saying young, but I do think this is actually a category that came out of sort of youth struggles with the various forms of politics and category that they inherited, and I respect that. I had some of the critiques that Kaji has articulated. I don't mind the essay. I'm there for the critique. It's just a bit short-sighted, however, in the end, to make it seem as if one group of people are the dupes of a system that actually works through making people feel as if they are the authors of their own identity. The whole system works that way. It's not that non-binary people are the only people who are subject to that fiction. But genderqueerness had a different moment. Maybe queerness isn't interesting to younger people. Maybe queerness already seemed like it had lost its punch. And they wanted to point to the actual frame that they were struggling with. But I think we could usefully bring it back in, you know, to add to the mix. And I also think we could add more diacritical marks. What is trans, you know, exclamation point, for example? That might be a different way of saying trans, or trans question mark. We should be using every piece of grammatical armature available to us, not just stopping with these subject, object, verb grammatical formulations.
Well, I mean, I was thinking that, you know, gender, if we want to be nerdy and talk about the word, it doesn't say binary, right? So gender queer, and to queer is to trouble something. So if you want to, kind of getting back to what Kaji is also talking about there, that you just recreate a new binary. Yeah. So you got the non-binary versus the binary, which is another binary. So gender queer, just in that sense, to me, doesn't do that. Which isn't to say that it's solves everything.
No, but it was an important word. And it's interesting that it didn't continue.
If the goal is to get beyond the binary, then. But I mean, just if I can go back a little bit to this question of radical feminism or what to do, which is not something we can solve in the next 5 minutes. But I mean, I think one thing that's really important to know is that in the Swedish context, it is actually people who call themselves feminists on the left. You know, one of them actually wrote the other day, Åsa Lindeberg, the other day, we need to be able to talk about this whole question with the bathrooms, you know? And so you get leftist feminist after leftist feminist who are sort of turning out to be extremely gender conservative in the sense that we need to maintain these strict binaries and we need to know who is, you know, allowed to be where. And the only time that they give a shit about things like prisons is when there is a possibility that somebody may be put into the wrong prison, right? They've never discussed carcerality. They've never been concerned with
They don't want to abolish the prison system. They just want to make sure that
we just need more police, more security, more cameras.
But that's security feminism, and you know, again. I mean, maybe we just go with the category of transversal. We pull that out of the gago, and it may be that we abandon feminism, but we should look at those positions and see what is feminist in them, if anything. What is feminist about that? I just don't see it. I don't see the feminist content in any of those positions, including the one you just described. These are traditional gender positions about maintaining the home, the gender hierarchy, the nuclear family. These do not speak to any of the topics or political struggling points that feminists have outlined. So I'm confused more than anything about what makes that feminist. Even that so-called left wing. What's even left wing there?
Yeah. I think also I don't know, as you said, the next 5 minutes would not be where we would solve, but I mean, nothing is new under the sun. You know, there have been coalitions, formulations, and I mean, we study with each other, but also, I mean, one of the my disappointments with the Black Panther Party was knowing that they organize with white people, because then that means I have to, you know, no offense, but it was quite a disappointing that, you know, but that is also like teaching each other that we need each other. We have to build coalitions to resist, but also just to respond to this turf maybe discourse that is, you know, now being implemented also on a, you know, governmental level, that we have to perhaps remember. I mean, for me, if I may speak for myself, I mean, one of the things that I, you know, fully prepare is also like to protect my community by all means necessary. I mean, that is the case. Like, we have to articulate how we care for each other and protect for each other. By the way, my voice is from the party, so sorry. I don't know, did it make sense, you know, like how I meant, but also this learning and unlearning how to build. It's nothing is new under the sun, as I said.
Right. No, absolutely. And you know, you're talking about various kinds of strategic alliances and moments where there might be a need for a kind of withdrawal or separatism. But I think that there are, you know, we're talking about abstraction and structure, and then we're talking about practicality and actual, you know, affiliative groups.
Yes.
And what's great about Feminist International is she kind of lays out, she's a sociologist, a Marxist sociologist. She's not an anarchist in the way that I'm implying. She wants to work through a state structure, Veronica Gago, to actualize real change. And I know we keep saying we can't do it in 5 minutes, and we can't, but we can point to some directions where things are happening. It's the same with, you know, indigenous groups who are saying, like, actually we do know how to be in relationship to environmental ruin and stop this disastrous tide of environmental collapse. If you want to know, indigenous groups, many of them around the world, in Latin America, in the Americas, in Australia, have lived in non-polluting ways for many hundreds of years. So there are many sources of information if we were to break with the way that we currently teach, with the way that the university organizes knowledge, with the way in which people share information. And if we were to be more suspicious of the kind of Western basis of knowledge and philosophy, and more curious and interested in these other systems that have lasted for thousands of years, that Euro-American scholars are just not interested in. And I think that's part of this kind of the arrogance of, you know, Western epistemologies, and then their entrenchment in this particular form of global capitalism that we're struggling against.
And it's also I mean, I'm full on going to indoctrinate you with my black Marxism, but
go for it.
But I keep landing, we keep landing in this. Lately, I've started to describe myself, and aggressively, as I said yesterday in Uppsala, like claim the role as cultural worker, if anything, because I love that I am a worker. We are workers, and if we see each other as thinkers, as artists, as workers, we will unite with other workers. And in that, in that union, literally the union that we have, is also a form of protection. That we can build coalitions in. I'm thinking, you know, I don't like this, like, you know, romanticized picture of liberation and, you know, these iconic figures that emerge and so on and so on. But we know there have been incredible moments in history, such as when the British mine workers, you know, and the queer, alliances, exactly. Although, you know, it's a very rom-com-y film, the film Pride.
Yeah, it's so good. Very
beautiful. Cried every time. No, but I think that is what we will do. And within that, I'm also thinking, like, I don't know, there's so many beautiful tools that we get from black trans feminism that we can collect. And maybe that, as you said, like, will require us meeting with each other in, you know, forums like Radical Lab or others, or initiatives. So I don't know. Sounds like we're gonna do something, but let's do it.
Okay. I know we don't. How much time do we have, Hendrik? Can we take a couple questions from the audience?
Yes. You may have all been wondering, when is sort of a Jack going to like play all these wonderful instruments? That is not going to happen.
This is a band.
We do have another event here at 4. So we actually all need to be out of this room at 2:40. I suggest we make the most of it.
Okay.
Yes.
Take a sort of quick couple of questions, but then I'm going to need you to actually abandon this building as soon as possible. So, question. I'm going to walk around basically. So raise your hand if you'd like.
There's one over there.
Could you help me? Oh, there. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, there's a mic there.
Two hands there.
Brilliant.
Just keep speaking into it.
Okay, now it's working. Thank you. Okay, so I will try to be somewhat short, but I think I want to actually respond to a couple of points that you made, Jack. about, because I think that in your sort of arguments around TERFs, I think you're ceding way too much ground to TERFs, which also, of course, means ceding way too much ground to fascists, to be drastic about it. And so I want to respond to a couple of points that you made. One of the points is that you cited Silvia Rivera. And as I'm sure you know, her speech was directed towards the gay and lesbian movement. It wasn't directed, towards the U.S. government, or it was addressed to that movement, which is actually the same thing then as trans women or other activists that speak out against TERFs do. And moving on. I think that you also, extended way too much sympathy towards this argument of protecting children in bathrooms, because in fact that is the exact same argument as the sort of fascist groomer rhetoric, and it's about, it's not about protecting children in any way.
No, I know.
And it's also not about.
I'm not saying that.
No, but it's also not about men in any way. It's not about like a valid concern for about men's violence that is then redirected towards trans women. It is rather about using a trans-misogynist rhetoric against trans women. Men has nothing to do with it in that sense. And another point is that also, I think it is extremely important that we as feminists and trans feminists grapple with the fact that actually TERFs do use the term feminism for themselves and have, in many cases, a very valid claim to that identity that is validated also by the feminist movement, and that dismissing that on a sort of semantic level of clearly they're not actually feminists is not grappling with that conflict, and it's in fact further marginalizing trans women. So those are my three main points.
I hear you that they are using the term about themselves, and that's why I'm saying I'm not sure whether one wants to make a hard claim on feminism at the moment when abortion rights are under attack, or whether one wants to abandon feminism altogether as a unifying concept and move to this, maybe the transversal queer trans movement, something like that. I hear you. But what I'm trying to say about the bathroom is that when the Mumsnet mum is like, I'm worried about the trans woman in the bathroom, it's because in this non-feminist way and in this trans-misogynist way, she doesn't believe that trans woman is a woman. That's the point. That's already the content. Some of the content of the trans-misogyny is a denial of womanhood to the trans woman, and therefore she's saying, but you're not a woman, therefore you're a bloke in the bathroom. And so my point is, if you're worried about men in the bathroom, that's different, because this is not somebody who you should see as a man in the bathroom. So we're not, I don't know what's at stake there exactly to quarrel about that piece of it.
I want to make sure we have the opportunity to take multiple questions.
Can I just quickly respond to that?
Sure.
Which is just to say that I think that TERFs, such as these Mumsnet TERFs, they hate trans women.
Right.
They don't hate men in general.
Exactly.
So when they're saying that trans women are men, it's not an argument about men. It's an active misgendering that is targeted towards trans women. That's my point.
Yeah. Okay.
I saw another hand in that area. Yes, please, Santiago.
Thanks. Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I wanted to come back to Veronica Gargo and this idea that in order to, or what you've said, to enact radical change, we need to find each other across identities. And I wanted to quote Irmgard Emmelheinz, who said that, we live now in this digital world where we kind of like imprisoned in our own singular experiences, in our own private worlds of meaning. And I was wondering if any of you on stage could sort of give us some clues, or maybe paint a picture of what this world can be, which is the one which comes after the destruction of the given system. Are there, for example, civic infrastructure like streetlights and tap water connected to white heteronormativity? What is this world that comes afterwards? Because I hope to be able to help, make it happen.
Look, the thing about worlds that come after is that that's always speculative, because we live within the logics of this world, and the logics of this world are impairing our ability to see what might come after, which is what makes people on the left, you know, the capitalist realists, and on the right, the sort of dystopianists, say this is the best we can do. So we better, you know, kind of get on with it, when in fact there's all kinds of speculative fiction writers like N.K. Jemisin and Octavia Butler and Ursula Le Guin, who have outlined what an alternative world could look like. The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin is a pretty fantastic, you know, representation of what an anarchist world might look like. It's a not romantic version either. And it's not perfect by any means. It's not even that appealing, to be honest. But it is to say things could easily be otherwise. This is not an inevitable arrangement of economy, body, sociality, politics, intimacy, and so on. But it doesn't help for a single person to articulate what that world would look like outside of fiction. What helps is for people to work together to create the conditions for something else to emerge.
You said something yesterday in Uppsala that I thought was like, gave language to a feeling, or maybe we'll answer a little bit, is I'm not as much interested in knowing what comes tomorrow as letting the people of tomorrow know that this is not working, what we have going on. That's like, you know, the genocidal politics of this world that we have right now, and we make language for that, to say this ain't working. And then, of course, hope one can dream, and I dream. I mean, as parents, you know, we want to leave our kids to a world that is so much better, but that is also like a way of like occupying their space. I mean, they will do that, but we give them a tool, and that is also a language in itself, to say, you guys, this ain't working. And that to me is, that can be formulated, that can be always, you know, processed and challenged, or as artists, you know, we make art, we create language, to borrow Toni Morrison's, you know, fantastic quote, we do language. And swear to God, Toni Morrison is like, please stop quoting me at every talk you do.
I'm sure she's not.
But, you know, we do language for what is not working, and that we continue to do that. I think I am so not interested in occupying tomorrow. I'm so much interested in letting us know that what we have today is not working. Damn, I sounded so smart.
Thank you. Maybe what I suggest we do, we take this to the restaurant and we have some sort of drinks and sort of a coffee. We're open for a while still, and we sort of continue a bit informally, please.
Yeah,
Sam.
I have one ad. Radical Love is making a comeback.
Yes.
We have one event on the 5th of May.
Great.
Write it down.
Like, where can we find more information?
As soon as me and Sam have had a fika.
Exactly.
But 5th of May is
5th of May.
set a date. Yes.
Noted. Thank you so
Thank
much. Warm applause, Jack
you.
Halberstam.
Fantastic. Amazing.
That was fun. Thank you for joining.
Darling.
Thank you, Jack. Warm applause, Ulrika Dahl, Samuel Girma. Woo! And a very warm applause to yourself for getting out of here in 2 minutes.